Right, I think that's good.
Good.
All right, okay. Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing our top 5 training misconceptions. Now, I think first of all, it's important to maybe understand what is a training misconception. What do we mean by training misconceptions?
I think training misconceptions are basically dogmas or beliefs that a lot of people have, which are actually just false. And I think it's an issue in fitness and bro science where someone says something once without much research or understanding behind it, and it just gets perpetuated as this truth when actually no one's really verified whether it is the case. And it's almost like Chinese whispers. The more it gets spread, the more true it becomes. When actually, with a little bit of digging, you can establish the reality of the situation, which is distinct from what most people believe.
Yeah, I definitely feel as well when it comes to like training misconceptions that maybe someone has learned something and they've done all the research initially and then that's it. They've not then kept up to date with stuff and how things have changed along the way. And because they may have had success doing something, that then that's now the way to do it and that's the only way. And I think the thing with the fitness industry is ever growing, ever evolving, and we're constantly learning new things. And it's like, don't get me wrong, not all new things are the right things. And that's why it's important for experience and an understanding of actual application of things. But it's making sure that if you hear new things and stuff like that, maybe it's the experimenting with that, that new way of doing something or that new thought process, and maybe seeing the respect, like, experimenting on yourself and so forth. And I think a good topic to start with is one of our most controversial episodes, which and also our most listened to episode, is the knee valgus is always a bad thing. So knee valgus, knees in. Whenever you see that in a squat, it means it's bad. Is that true, Ash?
That is most definitely not true.
Right.
So
Why?
we obviously go into a deep dive in the knee valgus episode, so check that out if you're interested to hear more. But essentially, it's based on a extrapolation of some research saying that ACL injuries happen in knee valgus, but the logic is bogus in that ACL injuries happen, or all injuries happen, at extreme ranges of motion or when there's a huge sort of uncontrolled motion, and every ligament will snap in a certain joint position. But that doesn't mean that joint position is inherently dangerous. It just means you've gone too far into that joint position, and that's resulted in this specific ligament snapping. Like if you go into elbow extension and you hyperextend, you're going to snap some shit in your elbow, and that's quite obvious. And it's the same with knee valgus. If you go into knee valgus and you go too far into it without control, and you don't have the motor control to decelerate the position, and there's a huge amount of force, then something's going to give. And it just so happens that in that position, the ACL is the victim there. In the episode, we go into loads of detail about why knee valgus is actually a good thing, both from a muscle loading point of view. It optimally loads the glute max, which is the biggest, strongest muscle in the body. So from a force generation point of view, having that knee valgus at least twitch is necessary for maximal performance, which is why when you look at the best squatters and weightlifters in the world, they will always have that slight knee valgus twitch, or quite an excessive one. If you look at Tia-Claire Toomey, her knees come almost touching together, and she's one of the best weightlifters in CrossFit. But also from a bone alignment point of view, the thigh bone lines up with the kneecap much better in knee valgus, whereas when you push the knees out, which is coached by a lot of training methodologies, I won't name any names, the grooves don't line up between the femoral condyles and the patellar grooves. They're actually going across each other. And if you've ever been lucky enough to play around with a cadaver or an animal skeleton, it's so obvious to see once you're holding it in your hands that the knee is much happier to flex and extend in a slight amount of valgus compared to varus. So slightly knees in versus slightly knees out. One last point on that before we move on. Every time you take a step or you run, you go slightly into knee valgus, and that is for those exact same reasons. The bone alignment and the muscle activation is better there. Like try running and pushing your knees out. I'd like to see people have a go at that, and send us your videos, because that'll be some good meme fodder.
I think it's funny because when I'm on the bike and I'm cycling, and I feel like when you're like, say, working at threshold and so, and you're getting tired, and the legs, they start to wander, they start to do whatever they do, just like when you're training, you're lifting, and like they do unconsciously whatever they want. But my conscious thought, whatever brings me back, is knees in, push down, on constantly on both sides, and then I feel, and it's not even just a feeling of more power. The numbers on the power meter go up, because now I'm actually, one, I'm conscious about what I'm doing, but also the knees in, just as you say, it feels a lot more comfortable and so forth. So it's a very natural feeling movement when you know that that's not a bad movement. I think if you've been told you cannot do this and so forth, every time that they say track in or anything like that, you're like, this shouldn't be. So you put this perceived feeling on it rather than what it actually is. And when you allow it, or you actually do it, it feels great, and because it feels like it's a lot more of a natural position for you to be in.
Spot on. And if you look at any babies or kids squatting, they always go valgus, because the body naturally knows where the strength is.
Yeah, they haven't been influenced by the outside world yet.
That's
So I think that also goes nicely onto our next part, which is flexibility is always a good thing. So I think we've done an episode all about flexibility versus stability, and the understanding of what they both are. But I guess you'd have to understand, what is flexibility. So like, what would be your definition of flexibility, Ash?
Flexibility is the available range of motion at a joint, and it doesn't discern between active and passive range. So what range of motion you can achieve yourself versus be put into using like somebody else, or a wall, or something static to pull yourself into position. And I think flexibility is one of the 10 key physical skills outlined in the CrossFit definition of fitness. And that is true, but only to a point. And what I see a lot of with people who come in for muscle imbalance assessments and injuries is that they've spent huge amounts of time continually getting more and more flexible, when actually they have more than adequate range to do CrossFit training. So say they're a competitive athlete, they can hit all the positions. They've got a great overhead squat, they have nice gymnastics positions, and that's pretty much like the good overhead position, good squat depth. Those are the main things that they need to be able to achieve, and they don't struggle to get into any of those ranges. So you've got to ask the question then, like, why are you investing your training time to increase your flexibility beyond that? And if we think about muscles as elastic bands, which is the best analogy for what they actually are and how they operate, you're essentially stretching those rubber bands to be longer and thinner, so they have less tension with which to stabilize the joints that they cross. So if you're snatching heavy, your muscles need to lengthen more before they then put the brakes on. So this is something really common for athletes who've done a lot of yoga and they've got excessive overhead range. They lose the bar behind because their shoulders don't switch on until it's too late, and when the bar's behind, it's very difficult to pull it back into a good catch position. So that athlete would be much better off tightening up those muscles, strengthening them and stabilizing them, teaching them to be active in the target position, which is the bottom of the overhead squat for that example. And don't get me wrong, if you have full control over a range of motion and you have tension and strength throughout the range, you can access it actively. That's nice, and it's nice to have, but it isn't necessary for the majority of people who can hit their positions adequately. Like, once you've got enough, just keep using it and maintain enough, and spend your training time on better causes.
Yeah, so it's that understanding of what you need your X amount of flexibility for, and then understand from that what you need to put in place to achieve that. And then if that does mean you need to do certain drills to kind of help with that range of motion, then whether you do that, but then you make sure you focus on that particular thing to improve that task that you're trying to get better at, rather than just going for an all-round approach. Don't get me wrong, if you're using yoga and other things as a form of like meditation, or as for outside performance, say enhancements, can be a great thing to do to kind of like down regulate and put yourself into like a nice state of mind, but it's not always necessarily a good thing for any specific performance increase.
That's it.
So I think a really common training misconception is that high intensity is better than low intensity. Now, where I think this comes about is pre-CrossFit days. Obviously, it was steady state cardio on a treadmill, maybe a stepper, bodybuilding focus, so aesthetic driven. Then you had CrossFit come about, which was saying, no, you actually need to now go as fast and hard as you can in a short amount of time to get metabolic changes. So then obviously improvements in your metabolism and so forth. Now, that then geared more towards the performance side of stuff. So I think understanding this part will be quite an interesting thought. So what would you say that is the biggest misconception that's in these two areas?
I think one of the CrossFit mantras, or the way they define themselves, is constantly varied functional movements performed at high intensity. And it has loads of benefits. Like, high intensity is really good for your health, and in terms of bang for buck, if you're training 3 hours a week, having some high intensity work in there for most people and most goals probably has the most utility. But that doesn't mean that all your training should always be high intensity, and that there is no benefit to the low intensity steady state work. And in endurance sport, this has been known for a long time. The long Sunday run, the long Sunday ride on the bike, there's really good evidence and science to show how the low intensity has huge benefits. We talked about it on the podcast with Jamie, how actually that just accumulated aerobic work, improving your aerobic efficiency. It does have fat oxidation benefits as well, even though you could lose weight faster with high intensity stuff. Actually, that's why bodybuilders do the long, low intensity stepper sessions, because it has much less stress on the body, but still does burn calories. So it might not get your high threshold fitness far better that fast, but actually it services the aerobic energy systems. And well, tell us about your experience with cycling, mate. Now you've added in so much more low intensity steady state. How do you feel? Like, what have you noticed as a result of that?
I think from the cycling and then taking it back into, like, say, the bodybuilding days, where my weight sessions were there to perform at high intensity relatively. So, decent weights, performing good contractions, working hard. The cardio was then there to obviously create that energy balance and, like, chip away and, as a burn fat without kind of doing too much extra stress, because that was for the weight sessions. And then controlling the diet was then where we then really start to fine tune things. Now, when I use my lower output, so like my steady state essentially on the bike, it's building up my general like aerobic base and also getting my legs conditioned to turning over multiple times for a set duration. Because this is, I think, a huge thing where when people get into something, say like cycling and running, they normally go from, say, 0 or like very minimal to then high volume. And but they think, but I'm working at such a low, like, steady state that it's not that bad for me. But so with cycling in particular, if you do, say, 60 revolutions a minute, right, and you're going to be doing that out for, say, 3 hours, that's a hell of a lot of revolutions got to go through your knees now and your hips. And it's like, people take that for granted. So but then I think it always then boils down to, what is the goal of your output? Are you doing high intensity for, say, what are you using high intensity for, or what are you using steady state for? So whenever I use long, slow rides, it's a basic one to kind of use it as like an active recovery, but also it's to get volume through the legs over a period of time, and also train myself to be able to work in a zone 2, like low perceived effort state, which is most of the time you're working at such high intensity. Say when you're doing intervals, like when you're trying to improve, say, your VO2 max and so forth, I'm working through sprints. But then when you've got your rest periods in between, it's having that ability to bring it back down, and also then understand what that feels like, and get your breathing back and so forth.
Yeah, spot on. I think that's a crucial point in that, especially for people who train a lot, even like 5 hours a week, having a percentage of that as a low intensity work will mean that less stress on the body, but still maintaining the volume. Whereas if you did 5 sessions, say you're relatively new to training, you do 5 high intensity sessions a week, you're very unlikely to be able to recover from that. Whereas if you do 2 or 3 high intensity, 2 or 3 lower intensity, you still get a good amount of volume. If you care about calories burnt, you still burn a good amount of calories, but you're getting reps through the body. Say it's miles when you're running or on the bike, you're still getting that workload done. So your tissue tolerance increases, your joints will strengthen up, but you're not smashing your nervous system in the same way that you would be with constantly high intensity work. So
exactly,
don't neglect it, as I've been guilty of.
Yeah, so have I. And it's because again, it's committing to feeling like you're not working hard, and that's what's mentally quite hard to do. And I think as well, if you want to try and apply this to, say, a CrossFit setting, it's in like, having your 3 to 4, say, normal Metcon classes, and then having one of the classes, which is like a form of active recovery, which might be like flow work, it could be just, doing some skill work, doing so that's not necessarily to a high end loading. And it's like basically it's points where you don't feel like you've worked that hard in a session, but you've maybe, acquired some skills, and it's not going to affect your training the next day, but you've come out better because you've now learned something. That could be just rowing and doing like a steady state row at set intervals. And it might be, say, go just doing repeats there. If you're able to do that and leave just thinking, do you know what? Fuck, I feel great. Then sweet. You
can improve without ending yourself is what it boils down to.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's just hard because, as we just said, it's a common misconception that high intensity is better than low intensity. So, and I think another one is strength means size. And I think that's when you compare, say, like a powerlifter and a bodybuilder, you can have the biggest bodybuilder, and most of the time at the high end, big bodybuilders are strong as shit. But if you put that same body on, say, a powerlifter, they'll be even stronger. Is like, you know what I mean? So there is that side of things. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an easy thing for people to get confused about, that if somebody looks big, they are strong. And if they are strong, they should be big. And they're actually very different adaptations for the body. And I was actually had a mate come in yesterday for an assessment and a session on, he's a squash and golf player. And we were talking about Rory McIlroy. When he started, he was like 10 stone, nothing, but he hit the ball as long as most of the guys on tour because he's very strong in the movement of the golf swing. And that means he had a really high level of skill and ability to contract muscle fibers efficiently. So he could create loads of force in that movement pattern, which is strength, like force production, but he actually didn't need a huge number of muscle fibers. So it's the same with throwing a ball, because he played cricket as well. We're talking about the guys who could throw a ball a long way were always quite surprising. They weren't the big, strong guys in the gym. They were generally quite whippy, skillful guys who just had the timing that they could use their whole body as one big unit and get that same power output from the muscle fibers, rather than just bodybuilding isolated, growing specific muscle groups for an aesthetic goal. And I think that links quite nicely to our podcast we did on health, performance and aesthetics, and how they're all distinct. So strength is a performance goal, whereas looking good and having size is an aesthetic goal. And the way you train for each of them is very distinct and shouldn't be confused. And I think there are obviously areas where there's a bit of crossover, like some people who are strong are also big and some people who are big are also strong, but the strongest aren't necessarily don't have the biggest muscles, and the biggest muscles definitely aren't the strongest.
No, and I think when it comes to that personally, I've found that one of the things I really like is because that perception essentially of being big means strong, but then when you then get to say doing any like gymnastic type movement, that's when it's like, hang on a minute, you shouldn't be able to do that. So that's in that misconception that to do those type of movements, you should probably be a bit more wiry. You know, that what you're talking about there with someone that can throw, someone that surprises people with that side of things. So the smaller person may be getting a great throw. When you then got a bigger person doing gymnastics and like getting themselves over the rings or on the top of the bar or whatever, it's like, oh, that wasn't what I thought. And that's always kind of, I've always liked to kind of be able to do, to make sure that I can always kind of like surprise people in a way. So, because it's like, I'm big, so it's like the fact that I'm relatively strong is like, you know, that's, you know, there's nothing there. So fair enough, you should be strong, you're big. But then you go on the other side and it's like, all right, cool. But same as when you got someone obviously lifting and like they're quite small and they're lifting like 3-4 times their body weight, you're like, fuck me, that's like, that is very impressive. So
that's it.
But and I think which another one that carries over with those two, a common misconception, is that fit means healthy. Now, this one we could go into one hell of a rabbit hole, and I think this is going to be an episode in itself. But as a bit of an overview and a ballpark, like fit means healthy. Now, I guess you obviously need to first define what fit means, and also then what health means, and how you'd measure both of them to understand which one means the other one, right?
Exactly. And back to that health, performance, aesthetics trade-off. Fitness is a performance metric. So you're measuring how fit you are for achieving a task, whether it's a sport or it's just an output. And there is always a trade-off where beyond a certain point, you get diminishing returns on health. So if somebody's super unfit and super unhealthy, some level of training is almost certainly going to improve their health, however you define that, whether it's, you know, cholesterol levels, resting blood glucose, or something along those lines. However, when you start moving up towards the super elite levels of performance, training is a stress on the body, and you're actually putting your body into a less healthy state. There's a lot more wear and tear on the joints. Obviously, most elite athletes have had some injuries which will probably affect them to some degree for the rest of their lives. And also just the sheer amount of work being done tears down tissues, puts lots of stress on the mind as well as the body. Yeah. So there is a point where actually you're having a negative impact on your health. And I think we talk about, I was just making the point about elite sport there, but it happens in the very enthusiastic gym goer as well, where they're actually training so much and so hard, they're probably less healthy compared to if they trained a little bit less and a little bit more easily. They're, again, depending how you define your health specifically, but in terms of blood markers, a lot of people would probably be better off by reining things in. They would be less fit and they wouldn't be able to perform as well. So maybe they're happy to make that trade-off. But I think where I see some room for improvement for people is if they just are more conscious of what they're training for, they can make that decision actively rather than mindlessly pursue performance and have a detrimental effect on their health, which they probably didn't anticipate happening, because in their mind they're thinking the fitter I am, the healthier I am, and that's not a truth.
Yeah, as you say, it's being clear on your why. And I think that's again, that was again one of our top episodes as well, is that understand your why and stuff like that side of things. And I think once you do understand the direction that your training is, the sacrifices that you may need to make along the way to achieve them, you're okay with, and they're not like oh fuck, I didn't know I was going to get unhealthy by being fitter. Yeah. So, and that's the thing, is if you're conscious about it, and it's I often say to one of my clients, and they do 3 times a week with me. They like to go to the gym twice. They also like to do 2 runs. And you're just like, so hold on, that's 7 days a week. And they have a very stressful job, very constantly not sleeping necessarily the best. And I'm just like, I think you should take a rest. I think you should maybe not go to the gym outside of our session and so forth. And it's that thing of more is better.
Yeah.
And we've again, we've mentioned this in the previous podcast, how more is more, and it's like it's context dependent. So I think a lot of these misconceptions are things where people just need to be a bit more conscious about what's being said, and also the thoughts behind it. So like just to recap, like the knee valgus is always a bad thing. I think the key thing there was the word, like, in a way, is always, because that's the misconception there, because it's not always a bad thing. So to understand why it's not always a bad thing will help enlighten you. Second one, flexibility is always a good thing, and it's like flexibility is a great thing, but to what extent and how much do you need? High intensity is better than low intensity. As we've just mentioned there, I think for the last 3 points, we've kind of alluded to that even comment there, the high intensity and low intensity, because it's understanding what you need, what one for, and understanding the balance to make sure that you get the best response out of it. Strength means size. Exactly. So it's like the biggest person is not always the strongest person, and vice versa. The smallest person isn't always the weakest person. So, and then fit means healthy. Well, as we said there, the fittest aren't always the healthiest, but you just need to make sure you've got clear tools to measure against, so you can monitor things along the way in case any changes need to be made, or if you want to make any changes. But yeah, I think that was really nice. A nice 5 training misconceptions. So as always, if you've got any other misconceptions that you maybe have at the moment, or thoughts that you maybe thought were a little bit controversial, or that you'd like to be discussed, do drop us a message, and we'd be happy to discuss your thoughts and maybe our thoughts on those thoughts. As always, if you did enjoy this episode and you're listening to it on Apple Podcasts, we do appreciate a 5-star review. 4 stars, it's not so bad, but 5-star, definitely the good one. And find us on Instagram at lunge.lift. 2021, we will be a lot more active, we promise. And but until then, thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.